There is a place in the mountains of North Carolina that was never supposed to exist in America. A mansion so large it contains 250 rooms, surrounded by 8,000 acres of land, built not by a king, but by a private citizen. At the height of the Gilded Age, one of the richest families in the nation created what remains the largest private home ever built in the United States, the legendary Biltmore Estate. But behind its grand halls and European elegance lies a deeper story. A story about the rise of the Vanderbilt family, a fortune built on railroads, and the quiet transformation of wealth, power, and legacy in America. Because Biltmore was never just a mansion, it was an attempt to build an American aristocracy, and history would decide whether that dream could survive. In the late decades of the 19th century, when the United States was remaking itself through industry, railroads, and immense concentrations of private wealth, architecture became one of the most visible languages of power. Few buildings express that language more clearly than Biltmore Estate, a vast private residence built during the height of America's Gilded Age. Rising from the rolling hills of western North Carolina, the house was not simply a home. It was an architectural declaration, an attempt to translate the scale of European aristocratic estates into an American landscape that had, until recently, been dominated by small farms, forests, and scattered mountain communities. The estate was commissioned by George Washington Vanderbilt II, the youngest son of one of the most powerful industrial families in American history. By the time George Vanderbilt began planning his country residence in the 1880s, the fortune accumulated by his grandfather, Cornelius Vanderbilt, had already reshaped the financial hierarchy of the United States. Through shipping lines and later the expansion of railroad empires, Cornelius Vanderbilt had helped create a level of private wealth that was unprecedented in American history. His fortune passed into a family whose ambitions extended beyond industry into culture, philanthropy, and the symbolic architecture of status. In the decades after the American Civil War, the country experienced a period of rapid economic expansion. Industrial capital flowed into railroads, steel, oil, and finance. Cities grew quickly, fortunes multiplied, and the elite families of New York and the Northeast began to imitate European aristocratic traditions of seasonal estates and monumental residences. Mansions appeared along Fifth Avenue, Newport's coastal avenues, and the Hudson River Valley. Yet even among these displays of wealth, Biltmore would emerge as something entirely different in scale. George Vanderbilt envisioned not simply a mansion, but an estate modeled on the great country houses of France and England. The house would dominate a vast landscape of forests, gardens, and farmland. To realize this vision, Vanderbilt purchased tens of thousands of acres in the mountains surrounding Asheville, a region that had recently begun attracting wealthy visitors seeking the mild climate and scenic beauty of the Blue Ridge Mountains. What had once been rural farmland and forest gradually transformed into a carefully managed private domain. The architectural design of the house was entrusted to Richard Morris Hunt, one of the most influential architects in the United States during the late 19th century. Hunt had trained at the École des Beaux-Arts, where he absorbed the principles of European classical architecture that would later shape many of America's most ambitious buildings. He had already designed opulent residences for prominent families, including several members of the Vanderbilt dynasty. Yet Biltmore offered something unique, the opportunity to construct the largest privately owned house ever built in the United States. Hunt's design drew heavily from the Château de Blois and other French Renaissance chateaux of the Loire Valley. The influence was deliberate. In the cultural imagination of the 19th century elite, the French Renaissance symbolized refinement, aristocratic lineage, and artistic patronage. By echoing these architectural forms, Vanderbilt and Hunt were situating an American industrial fortune within a much older European tradition of landed nobility. Construction began in 1889, and the scale of the project quickly became evident. Thousands of laborers, artisans, and craftsmen were employed over the course of several years. Stone was quarried locally, massive timbers were transported across the growing railroad network, and specialized artisans carved ornamental details that would decorate the building's facades and interiors. The resulting structure eventually contained 250 rooms, including libraries, banquet halls, indoor gardens, and an extraordinary collection of art and rare books. Yet the house itself was only one element of a broader vision. The surrounding landscape was shaped under the direction of Frederick Law Olmsted, already famous for designing Central Park. Olmsted approached Biltmore not merely as a garden project, but as a comprehensive environmental transformation. Vast areas of forest were replanted and managed scientifically, making the estate one of the earliest large-scale experiments in American forestry. Roads, meadows, and carefully arranged vistas were designed to create a sense of natural grandeur, while subtly guiding the visitor's experience of the landscape. The collaboration between Hunt and Olmsted produced something rarely seen in American architecture at the time, a unified composition of building and environment. The approach roads curved through forests before revealing the chateau-like mansion on a gentle rise, framed by mountains in the distance. Gardens unfolded in terraces and formal patterns, while beyond them, the estate stretched outward into managed forests and working farms. For George Vanderbilt, the estate served several purposes. It was a retreat from the pressures of New York society, a place for intellectual pursuits, and a setting for gatherings of artists, scholars, and writers. Unlike some of his relatives, Vanderbilt cultivated a reputation as a patron of literature and art. His library eventually held thousands of volumes, reflecting his deep interest in history, philosophy, and travel. Yet even as the estate represented cultural aspiration, it also embodied the inequalities of the Gilded Age. The enormous wealth required to build and maintain such a property was rooted in the economic transformations that had created both industrial prosperity and profound social division. Railroads and financial networks had generated fortunes, but they also reshaped labor, urban life, and regional economies across the country. Biltmore thus stood at a crossroads of historical forces. It represented the culmination of a family fortune that began with shipping and railroads. It reflected the architectural ambitions of an American elite eager to emulate European aristocracy. And it transformed a rural Appalachian landscape into one of the most ambitious private estates in the nation. When the house was finally opened to guests on Christmas Eve in 1895, the scale of the achievement was immediately apparent. Newspapers described a residence unlike anything previously constructed in the United States. Its towers, steep roofs, and elaborate stonework seemed almost transplanted from another continent. Yet it was unmistakably American in its origins, financed by industrial wealth, and constructed through the labor networks of a rapidly modernizing nation. The estate's creation marked the height of Vanderbilt influence, but it also hinted at the fragile nature of such fortunes. The economic and social structures that produced these grand estates would soon face new pressures, from taxation, economic change, and shifting cultural attitudes toward wealth and privilege. The story of Biltmore is therefore not only about architecture, it is about the rise of a dynasty, the transformation of a landscape, and the complicated legacy of wealth during one of the most dramatic periods in American history. In the quiet valleys surrounding Asheville, the great house still stands today, its stone walls and vast grounds preserving the memory of an era when private fortunes attempted to rival the grandeur of European courts. But the deeper history of Biltmore lies not only in its architecture, but in the generations of ambition, industry, and cultural aspiration that made such a place possible. And to understand that story fully, one must look back further, beyond the estate itself, to the rise of the Vanderbilt family and the economic empire that first made such a vision conceivable. Long before the towers of Biltmore Estate appeared above the forests of the Blue Ridge Mountains, the wealth that made such an estate possible had been built along the busy waterways of New York City. The story of the estate is inseparable from the rise of the Vanderbilt family itself, a rise that began not with inherited land or noble lineage, but with the relentless expansion of American commerce in the early 19th century. At the center of that story stood Cornelius Vanderbilt, the patriarch whose fortune would become one of the largest ever accumulated in the United States during the Gilded Age. Born in 1794 on Staten Island, Vanderbilt entered a world that was still largely maritime. The young American Republic depended heavily on coastal trade and river transport, and the harbors around New York had become one of the busiest commercial environments in the country. Vanderbilt began working on boats as a teenager, ferrying passengers and goods across the waters that connected Staten Island with Manhattan. His early ventures were modest, but they revealed a pattern that would define his career: aggressive competition, relentless efficiency, and an ability to identify emerging transportation markets before his rivals. By the 1820s and 1830s, as steam-powered vessels transformed maritime travel, Vanderbilt expanded his operations into steamship lines along the eastern seaboard. These early shipping ventures unfolded during a transformative era in American economic history. The Erie Canal opening had connected the Great Lakes to the Atlantic Ocean through New York, accelerating trade across the interior of the continent. Goods that once required weeks of difficult transport could now move more quickly between agricultural regions and coastal markets. New York City soon emerged as the dominant commercial gateway of the United States. Vanderbilt thrived in this environment. Known among contemporaries as the Commodore, he developed a reputation for ruthless competition. When rivals attempted to dominate shipping routes through monopolies or exclusive contracts, Vanderbilt frequently undercut their prices until they either abandoned the route or negotiated with him directly. These tactics sometimes provoked controversy, but they also allowed him to accumulate capital at a remarkable pace. By the mid-19th century, Vanderbilt's ambitions expanded beyond maritime trade. The future of American transportation was increasingly tied to railroads, a technology that promised faster connections across the expanding nation. After the California Gold Rush, migration and commerce surged westward, intensifying demand for reliable transportation networks. Railroads soon became the backbone of American industrial expansion. Vanderbilt entered the railroad industry in the 1860s, acquiring controlling interests in several important lines serving the northeastern United States. Among the most significant was the New York Central Railroad, which eventually formed the core of a vast transportation empire, linking major cities and commercial hubs. Under Vanderbilt's leadership, competing rail lines were consolidated into more efficient systems, creating networks capable of moving freight and passengers across enormous distances. The timing of this expansion was critical. The end of the American Civil War unleashed a surge of industrial development across the country. Railroads carried coal from mines, steel from factories, and agricultural products from the Midwest to eastern ports. The economic structure of the United States shifted rapidly toward large-scale industrial capitalism. By the time of his death in 1877, Cornelius Vanderbilt had accumulated a fortune estimated at over $100 million, an amount that would be equivalent to many billions of dollars in modern terms. Yet unlike European aristocratic wealth, which was often tied to centuries of land ownership, the Vanderbilt fortune had been created within a single lifetime. This rapid accumulation of wealth reflected the extraordinary economic transformations taking place across the United States during the 19th century. The inheritance of this fortune would shape the lives of Vanderbilt's descendants in complex ways. Much of the estate passed to his son, William Henry Vanderbilt, who expanded the family's railroad empire even further. Under William Henry's management, the New York Central system grew into one of the most powerful transportation networks in North America, connecting cities such as Chicago, Boston, and New York. The rapid growth of Vanderbilt wealth coincided with a cultural transformation among America's elite. As fortunes grew larger, wealthy families increasingly turned to architecture, philanthropy, and social institutions to solidify their public status. Grand mansions appeared along urban avenues and coastal resorts, serving both as residences and symbols of economic power. Within the Vanderbilt family, this architectural impulse became especially visible. Several members of the dynasty commissioned enormous residences designed by leading architects of the era. In Newport, lavish summer cottages, such as the Breakers, demonstrated the family's willingness to invest extraordinary sums in architectural spectacle. These houses were not simply private homes. They were stages upon which the rituals of elite society were performed. Yet George Vanderbilt's ambitions differed in important ways from those of his relatives. Unlike some members of the family who were deeply involved in finance and railroads, George cultivated intellectual interests. He traveled widely in Europe, studied languages, and assembled collections of art and literature. His vision for Biltmore reflected these personal inclinations. Rather than constructing another urban palace or seaside mansion, he sought to create a secluded estate devoted to culture, nature, and learning. The choice of location in western North Carolina was therefore significant. At the time, the region around Asheville was emerging as a destination for wealthy travelers seeking clean mountain air and scenic landscapes. Railroads had recently connected the area to major cities, making travel more accessible for affluent visitors. Vanderbilt saw in the region both natural beauty and the opportunity to shape an environment according to his own ideals. Beginning in the late 1880s, Vanderbilt purchased large tracts of land from local farmers and landowners. Over time, these purchases expanded into an estate of more than 125,000 acres. Entire communities were gradually incorporated into the growing property, while new roads, farms, and managed forests were established under the supervision of professional planners and agricultural experts. The transformation of the land was overseen in part by Frederick Law Olmsted, whose approach to landscape design emphasized both aesthetics and ecological stewardship. Olmsted recognized the environmental challenges facing the Appalachian region, where logging and farming had already begun to erode fragile mountain soils. Under his guidance, the estate developed one of the earliest scientifically managed forestry programs in the United States. Thus, even before the mansion itself was completed, Biltmore had already become a complex experiment in land management, architecture, and social ambition. The estate combined European aesthetic ideals with emerging American practices in forestry and agriculture. It also required a vast workforce: builders, artisans, farmers, and domestic staff, whose labor sustained the daily operation of the property. By the time construction of the house neared completion in the mid-1890s, Biltmore had grown into a self-contained world. Villages were built to house workers. Farms produced food for the estate. Forests were carefully monitored and replanted. The property functioned almost like a private domain, reflecting both Vanderbilt's wealth and his vision of a cultivated landscape. Yet beneath this carefully arranged environment lay a deeper tension. The fortune that supported Biltmore had been generated by the aggressive expansion of industrial capitalism, a system that was increasingly criticized during the late 19th century. Labor disputes, economic inequality, and political debates about corporate power were becoming central issues in American society. The estate therefore stood at the intersection of two historical currents. On one hand, it represented the extraordinary possibilities of wealth during the Gilded Age. On the other, it existed within a society that was beginning to question the concentration of such wealth in the hands of a few families. When George Vanderbilt finally welcomed guests to Biltmore in 1895, the estate embodied both triumph and uncertainty. It was the grandest private residence in America, yet it had been built during a period when public attitudes toward industrial fortunes were slowly beginning to change. And as the 20th century approached, the very forces that had created the Vanderbilt Empire would begin to reshape the future of Biltmore itself. By the early 1890s, the vast estate surrounding Biltmore Estate had begun to take shape. But the most visible expression of George Washington Vanderbilt II's ambition still stood in scaffolding and unfinished stone. The mansion itself, designed by Richard Morris Hunt, was rising slowly from the hills of the Blue Ridge Mountains, a structure whose scale had little precedent in American residential architecture. Every element of the project reflected a careful attempt to merge European aristocratic tradition with the immense resources made available by the industrial wealth of the Gilded Age. Construction officially began in 1889. At its peak, the building effort employed thousands of workers, including masons, carpenters, metalworkers, woodcarvers, and decorative artisans. Many of these craftsmen had specialized skills drawn from traditions of European architecture, and some were recruited specifically for the project. Their work unfolded over 6 years, transforming a rural hillside into the largest private residence ever built in the United States. The design that Hunt created was inspired heavily by the chateaux of Renaissance France. Vanderbilt had traveled extensively across Europe, and he admired the monumental residences of the Loire Valley, where noble families had built elaborate country estates during the 16th century. Among the structures that influenced Biltmore were the towers and sculptural ornamentation of Château de Chambord and Château de Blois. These buildings were not simply residences. They were symbols of dynastic prestige and royal patronage. Hunt understood that the American version of such architecture needed to balance grandeur with modern practicality. The resulting building measured more than 175,000 square feet, containing approximately 250 rooms. Its limestone exterior featured steeply pitched roofs, elaborate dormer windows, and tall towers that gave the structure a silhouette reminiscent of European castles. Yet inside, the house incorporated modern technologies that reflected the innovations of the late 19th century. Electric lighting, central heating, elevators, and indoor plumbing were integrated into the design, making the house one of the most technologically advanced private residences of its era. These systems required complex engineering solutions, particularly given the building's size. Beneath the elegant halls and libraries lay mechanical infrastructure that allowed the estate to function with a level of comfort that many urban homes had not yet achieved. The interior spaces were organized to create a carefully choreographed experience of scale and authority. Visitors entering the mansion encountered the soaring Biltmore Banquet Hall, a cavernous room rising 7 stories in height. The hall's long dining table could accommodate dozens of guests, while massive stone fireplaces and intricate tapestries evoked the atmosphere of medieval European great halls. The design reinforced Vanderbilt's intention to situate the estate within the traditions of aristocratic hospitality. Nearby stood one of the most significant rooms in the house, Vanderbilt's private library. George Vanderbilt was widely known among his contemporaries for his intellectual interests. Over the course of his life, he collected thousands of books in multiple languages, ranging from classical literature to travel narratives and philosophical works. The library became both a personal sanctuary and a symbol of cultural aspiration. In an era when newly wealthy American families sometimes faced criticism for their lack of aristocratic lineage, the cultivation of art, literature, and scholarship offered a different form of legitimacy. The interiors of the house were decorated with artworks and furnishings gathered during Vanderbilt's travels. European paintings, antique tapestries, carved wood paneling, and marble sculptures filled the rooms. Each space reflected the influence of historical styles, from Renaissance revival ornamentation to the grand traditions of European decorative arts. Yet despite the richness of its decoration, the house remained fundamentally a private residence rather than a museum. Beyond the formal rooms used for entertaining, the mansion also contained extensive domestic quarters. The daily operation of Biltmore required a large staff of servants who lived and worked within the house. Kitchens, laundry facilities, storage rooms, and staff dining areas were carefully arranged in separate sections of the building. This spatial organization reflected the hierarchical structure typical of elite households during the late 19th century. While the mansion itself captured public attention, the surrounding landscape remained equally central to Vanderbilt's vision. The grounds were shaped under the guidance of Frederick Law Olmsted, whose work extended far beyond decorative gardens. Olmsted believed that landscape architecture could influence human well-being and environmental stability. At Biltmore, he applied these principles on an unprecedented scale. Large areas of farmland were reorganized into a model agricultural operation. Crops were cultivated not only to supply the estate, but also to demonstrate modern farming techniques. Livestock breeding programs and dairy production formed part of a carefully planned rural economy within the estate's boundaries. Even more influential was the development of scientific forestry. Much of the land Vanderbilt purchased had been heavily logged or poorly managed by previous owners. Under Olmsted's guidance, and later the work of professional foresters, the estate became a center for early forestry education in the United States. Replanting programs restored damaged forests, and experimental methods of sustainable timber management were introduced. These environmental initiatives would eventually contribute to the broader conservation movement that gained momentum in the early 20th century. The forests of Biltmore later influenced national forestry policy and helped inspire the creation of nearby protected lands such as the Pisgah National Forest, one of the first national forests established in the eastern United States. By the time construction of the mansion neared completion in 1895, Biltmore had grown into an extraordinary synthesis of architecture, landscape design, and economic ambition. Its scale was unmatched among private homes in America, yet its conception was rooted in European aristocratic traditions that stretched back centuries. When the estate formally opened on Christmas Eve of that year, Vanderbilt welcomed family and guests to celebrate the completion of a project that had taken nearly a decade to realize. Newspapers and visitors quickly described Biltmore as an architectural marvel, a symbol of the extraordinary wealth that had emerged during the Gilded Age. But beneath the celebration lay a quieter reality. The era that produced such monumental estates was already beginning to change. Political reform movements, new tax policies, and shifting cultural attitudes toward wealth were gradually reshaping the American social landscape. Biltmore had been created at the height of a particular historical moment, a moment when industrial fortunes seemed capable of building private worlds that rivaled the palaces of Europe. Yet the future would reveal that even the grandest estates were not immune to the economic and social transformations of the 20th century. When Biltmore Estate opened its doors to family and invited guests on Christmas Eve in 1895, it immediately became one of the most remarkable private residences in the United States. Rising above the wooded hills near Asheville, the mansion represented not only the architectural ambition of Richard Morris Hunt, but also the personal vision of George Washington Vanderbilt II. Yet while the building itself had already captured public imagination, the daily life that unfolded within its walls revealed a quieter and more complex story about wealth, culture, and social hierarchy during the Gilded Age. Unlike some of his relatives in the Vanderbilt family, George Vanderbilt preferred a life centered on intellectual pursuits rather than aggressive business management. He was widely known among contemporaries for his interest in literature, art, and European history. These interests shaped the atmosphere of Biltmore. The house was designed not merely for display, but also for conversation, study, and the cultivation of cultural life. At the center of this intellectual world stood Vanderbilt's library, one of the most significant private book collections assembled by an American in the late 19th century. The library eventually contained more than 20,000 volumes, including works of philosophy, travel, history, and classical literature in several languages. Vanderbilt spent long hours reading and corresponding with scholars, writers, and artists who visited the estate. The quiet rooms of the library contrasted sharply with the enormous public spaces of the house, suggesting that Biltmore was intended as both a retreat and a stage for social gatherings. The estate quickly became a destination for prominent visitors. Writers, diplomats, and members of the American elite traveled to the mountains of North Carolina to experience the unusual world Vanderbilt had created. Guests arriving by train in Asheville were transported by carriage through the carefully planned roads of the estate, passing forests and fields designed by Frederick Law Olmsted before reaching the towering stone facade of the mansion. Once inside, visitors encountered a household operating with remarkable complexity. Maintaining a residence of this scale required a large staff of domestic workers. Dozens of servants lived within the house itself, occupying quarters located in separate corridors and upper floors that remained largely invisible to guests. These workers managed the kitchens, cleaned the vast rooms, maintained fires in the fireplaces, and ensured that the routines of daily life proceeded smoothly. The social structure of such a household reflected long-established traditions inherited from European aristocratic estates. At the top stood the Vanderbilt family and their guests. Beneath them was a carefully organized staff hierarchy that included butlers, housekeepers, cooks, footmen, maids, and numerous other specialized roles. Each position carried distinct responsibilities and levels of authority, ensuring that the mansion functioned almost like a small institution. Beyond the walls of the house itself, hundreds more workers supported the broader operations of the estate. Farmers cultivated crops in the surrounding fields. Stable hands cared for horses used in transportation and leisure riding. Foresters monitored the vast wooded areas that covered much of the property. Artisans and mechanics maintained the infrastructure necessary to keep the estate running. George Vanderbilt also invested heavily in agricultural innovation. The estate's farms were organized as a model agricultural enterprise, introducing modern farming techniques that were still relatively uncommon in the region. Dairy production became an important component of the estate economy, and experiments in livestock breeding sought to improve the quality of local agricultural practices. The village of Biltmore Village was constructed near the entrance of the estate to house many of the workers and their families. Designed with distinctive European-inspired architecture, the village reflected Vanderbilt's interest in creating a planned community that blended aesthetic design with practical function. Shops, cottages, and public spaces were arranged along carefully planned streets, forming a small settlement connected closely to the daily life of the estate. Despite the enormous scale of Biltmore, the atmosphere of the household remained relatively restrained compared with some other Vanderbilt residences. In places such as Newport, members of the family hosted lavish social seasons filled with extravagant balls and elaborate displays of wealth. George Vanderbilt's gatherings tended to be quieter, focusing more on cultural exchange and intellectual discussion. Seasonal rhythms shaped life at the estate. Winters were often spent in the mild climate of the North Carolina mountains, while summers sometimes brought travel to Europe. During these journeys, Vanderbilt continued to collect art and books, gradually expanding the cultural treasures housed within Biltmore's walls. Yet even in its most tranquil moments, the estate remained connected to broader economic forces. The wealth that sustained the household had originated in the transportation empire established by Cornelius Vanderbilt and expanded by later generations. Railroads, industrial markets, and financial networks continued to shape the fortune that allowed Biltmore to exist. By the late 1890s, however, the American economy was undergoing significant changes. Financial panics, labor conflicts, and political debates over corporate power increasingly challenged the dominance of industrial magnates. The Panic of 1893 had revealed the vulnerability of even powerful economic systems, leading to bank failures, unemployment, and widespread public anxiety. These tensions did not immediately threaten the stability of the Vanderbilt fortune, but they signaled a shifting social climate. Progressive reform movements were beginning to question the concentration of wealth among a small number of industrial families. Public discussions about taxation, corporate regulation, and labor rights were gradually reshaping the national conversation. Within the quiet halls of Biltmore, such debates may have seemed distant. The estate continued to operate according to the rhythms established during its early years, guests arriving for visits, servants maintaining the household, and Vanderbilt himself devoting time to reading and travel. Yet history rarely remains still. Beneath the calm surface of estate life, forces were gathering that would eventually transform both the Vanderbilt family and the grand world they had created during the Gilded Age. The story of Biltmore, like the story of the Vanderbilt dynasty itself, would soon confront the realities of a new century, one marked by economic upheaval, shifting cultural values, and the gradual decline of many of America's great private fortunes. In the early years after the completion of Biltmore Estate, the great mansion stood as a quiet center of intellectual life and carefully managed rural industry. Yet despite the immense scale of the estate and the wealth that sustained it, the personal life of George Washington Vanderbilt II remained relatively private compared with other members of the Vanderbilt family. For several years after the house opened in 1895, Vanderbilt lived as a bachelor, devoting much of his time to travel, scholarship, and the continued development of the estate. That changed in 1898 when Vanderbilt married Edith Stuyvesant Dresser, a woman whose family connections extended deep into the social networks of American high society. Edith was also distantly related to George Washington, a lineage that carried symbolic significance in a society that still valued historical pedigree alongside newly acquired wealth. The marriage brought a new social energy to Biltmore. While George Vanderbilt had approached the estate largely as a cultural retreat, Edith Vanderbilt embraced a more active role in shaping its social and philanthropic life. She was known for her intelligence, organizational ability, and strong interest in community affairs. Under her influence, Biltmore became more deeply connected to the surrounding region and its people. The couple's life together at Biltmore combined elements of aristocratic tradition with a distinctly American sense of experimentation. Guests continued to visit the estate for extended stays, enjoying the elaborate gardens, forests, and libraries that defined Vanderbilt's vision. Yet Edith also encouraged greater interaction between the estate and the communities around Asheville, supporting charitable efforts and local development projects. In 1900, the family welcomed the birth of their only child, Cornelia Stuyvesant Vanderbilt. The arrival of an heir added new meaning to the estate. What had once been primarily a personal project now took on the character of a family legacy, a property intended to pass from one generation to the next. At the turn of the 20th century, the Vanderbilt name still carried enormous economic influence. The transportation empire created by Cornelius Vanderbilt continued to shape American commerce through networks such as the New York Central Railroad. Yet the world surrounding these industrial fortunes was changing rapidly. New technologies, corporate mergers, and regulatory pressures were beginning to reshape the structure of American capitalism. At the same time, political reform movements were gaining strength. The Progressive Era brought increasing scrutiny to large concentrations of wealth and power. Journalists, sometimes known as muckrakers, investigated the practices of powerful corporations, while lawmakers debated new forms of taxation and regulation. These developments did not immediately threaten the stability of Biltmore, but they signaled a broader transformation in American society. The great fortunes of the 19th century were no longer viewed solely as symbols of progress and ambition. Increasingly, they became subjects of public debate and criticism. Within the estate itself, however, Daily life continued to unfold with a sense of stability. The agricultural operations expanded, producing dairy products, crops, and timber that contributed to the estate's economic sustainability. Scientific forestry remained a central project, and the work carried out on the estate influenced broader developments in American conservation. One of the most significant figures in this effort was Gifford Pinchot, who briefly worked at Biltmore during the early development of its forestry program. Pinchot would later become the first chief of the United States Forest Service, playing a major role in the national conservation movement. His early experiences managing forests at Biltmore helped demonstrate that large-scale forestry could be practiced scientifically and sustainably. Despite these accomplishments, the estate remained expensive to maintain. The enormous house required constant upkeep, the staff remained large, and the surrounding lands demanded careful management. For the moment, the Vanderbilt fortune was still capable of sustaining these costs. But the long-term financial burden of such estates was already becoming apparent across the United States. Many families who had built vast mansions during the Gilded Age would eventually struggle to maintain them. Changing tax policies, economic downturns, and shifts in social attitudes gradually made it more difficult to sustain the extravagant lifestyles that had defined the late 19th century. For George and Edith Vanderbilt, however, these challenges still seemed distant. The estate remained vibrant, filled with guests, staff, and the steady rhythms of agricultural life. Young Cornelia Vanderbilt grew up surrounded by the extraordinary environment her parents had created. Libraries, gardens, forests, and the towering architecture of one of America's most ambitious private homes. Yet history would soon intervene in ways that neither George nor Edith could fully anticipate. The first major turning point came unexpectedly in 1914, when George Vanderbilt died at the age of 51, following complications from an appendectomy. His death marked the end of the estate's founding generation. The man who had imagined Biltmore and guided its creation was gone, leaving Edith Vanderbilt with the enormous responsibility of managing the property and preserving the legacy he had built. The world beyond the mountains was also changing rapidly. Only months after Vanderbilt's death, Europe descended into conflict with the outbreak of the World War I. The global war would reshape economies, societies, and political systems across continents. Even the quiet hills surrounding Biltmore would feel the distant consequences of that transformation. The estate that had been built at the height of American industrial optimism was about to face a new century, one marked by uncertainty, economic pressure, and the gradual unraveling of many Gilded Age fortunes. The death of George Washington Vanderbilt II in 1914 left Biltmore Estate at a moment of profound transition. For nearly 3 decades, Vanderbilt had served as both the financial foundation and intellectual architect of the estate. His interests in art, literature, forestry, and agriculture had shaped every dimension of the property. Without him, the responsibility for preserving that world fell largely to his widow, Edith Stuyvesant Dresser Vanderbilt. Edith Vanderbilt suddenly found herself overseeing one of the most complex private estates in the United States. The property still encompassed tens of thousands of acres of farmland and forest in the mountains near Asheville, and the enormous mansion required a permanent staff and constant maintenance. Yet the circumstances surrounding the estate were changing rapidly, both economically and politically. Only months after George Vanderbilt's death, the outbreak of the World War I transformed global trade, industry, and agriculture. Although the United States would not formally enter the war until 1917, the economic effects were already being felt across the country. Markets shifted, transportation networks adjusted to wartime demands, and agricultural production became increasingly tied to national supply needs. Edith Vanderbilt responded to these changes with pragmatic determination. Rather than retreating from the responsibilities of managing the estate, she expanded her involvement in its operations. The farms at Biltmore were reorganized to support wartime agricultural production, and the estate became an active participant in national food supply efforts. Crops and dairy products produced on the estate contributed to regional markets during a time when food security had become a major national concern. At the same time, Edith maintained many of the intellectual and cultural traditions that George Vanderbilt had established. The library remained an important part of the estate's identity, and the preservation of the mansion itself became a central priority. Yet maintaining such a vast property was becoming increasingly expensive. especially in a country where economic conditions were evolving rapidly. During the early 20th century, many American families who had built enormous estates during the Gilded Age were confronting a difficult reality. The economic system that had produced their fortunes was shifting, and the cost of sustaining large private residences was rising steadily. New federal income taxes, introduced after the ratification of the 16th Amendment to the United States Constitution, altered the financial calculations of wealthy families across the country. For estates like Biltmore, these changes meant that long-term survival would require adaptation. Edith Vanderbilt recognized that the estate's enormous landholdings represented both a burden and an opportunity. In 1917, she made one of the most consequential decisions in the history of the property by selling approximately 87,000 acres of Biltmore forest land to the federal government. This land sale helped form the foundation of the Pisgah National Forest, one of the earliest national forests in the eastern United States. The transaction represented a remarkable shift from private ownership to public conservation. Much of the land that had once been part of Vanderbilt's private domain became permanently protected wilderness, accessible to the American public. The decision reflected the influence of early conservation movements that had gained momentum in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Leaders such as Theodore Roosevelt and Gifford Pinchot had championed the idea that forests and natural landscapes should be preserved and managed scientifically for the benefit of the nation. Biltmore's forestry program had already contributed to this philosophy, and the creation of Pisgah National Forest extended its legacy on a much larger scale. For Edith Vanderbilt, the sale of the forest land also provided essential financial relief. Maintaining the entire original estate had become increasingly impractical. By transferring a significant portion of the land to federal ownership, she preserved the core of the property while ensuring the survival of the surrounding environment. Meanwhile, young Cornelia Stuyvesant Vanderbilt was growing up within the extraordinary world of Biltmore. As the only child of George and Edith Vanderbilt, she stood as the future heir to the estate. Her childhood unfolded within the vast rooms of the mansion, surrounded by books, artworks, and landscapes that few American children ever experienced. Cornelia's upbringing reflected both privilege and expectation. The estate was not simply a residence. It was a complex institution with historical significance and financial challenges. Preparing her for the responsibility of inheriting Biltmore meant understanding not only its grandeur, but also the economic realities that sustained it. The decades following the First World War would test those realities in ways that few families anticipated. The social world that had defined the Gilded Age was fading, replaced by a more modern and uncertain era. Economic cycles, changing cultural values, and shifting patterns of wealth were slowly reshaping the landscape of American elite society. Yet through these changes, Biltmore remained standing, a monumental reminder of an earlier age. Its towers still rose above the hills of North Carolina, and its halls continued to echo with the footsteps of guests, workers, and the family whose history had become inseparable from the estate itself. But the most severe challenges were still ahead. Within a generation, economic catastrophe would sweep across the United States, threatening the survival of many of the great estates built during the age of industrial wealth, and Biltmore would be forced to reinvent itself in ways its creator had never imagined. By the late 1920s, the world that had produced the great private estates of the Gilded Age was already fading. The generation that had accumulated vast industrial fortunes during the 19th century was passing away, and the economic systems that supported those fortunes were evolving rapidly. At Biltmore Estate, these changes were becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. The estate had survived the first major transition after the death of George Washington Vanderbilt II, largely due to the careful management of Edith Stuyvesant Dresser Vanderbilt. Her decision to sell a large portion of the estate's forests to create the Pisgah National Forest had stabilized the property financially and ensured the preservation of the surrounding landscape. But new challenges were approaching. In 1924, Cornelia Stuyvesant Vanderbilt, the only child of George and Edith Vanderbilt, married John Francis Amherst Cecil, a member of a prominent British aristocratic family connected to the House of Cecil. The marriage symbolized the continuing relationship between American industrial wealth and European aristocratic tradition. For many observers, it seemed to affirm that Biltmore had secured its place within a transatlantic world of privilege and social prestige. Cornelia and John Cecil began their married life at Biltmore, and the estate once again became the setting for social gatherings and cultural events. Their presence suggested continuity, a new generation prepared to carry forward the legacy of George Vanderbilt's vision. Yet the broader economic environment surrounding them was growing unstable. In October 1929, the Wall Street crash of 1929 triggered the beginning of the Great Depression, one of the most severe economic disasters in modern history. Banks failed, businesses collapsed, and millions of Americans lost their jobs. The effects of the crisis spread rapidly across industries, including agriculture and tourism, two sectors closely connected to the economy of Western North Carolina. For large private estates across the United States, the Depression represented an existential threat. Many families who had once maintained enormous houses and vast properties could no longer afford their upkeep. Mansions were abandoned, sold, or demolished as financial pressures mounted. Even families whose fortunes remained substantial found it increasingly difficult to justify the expense of maintaining residences built for a different era. Biltmore faced the same dilemma. The cost of maintaining the massive mansion, managing farmland, and supporting staff remained high, while the economic environment surrounding the estate was deteriorating. Rather than allow the property to fall into decline, the Vanderbilt and Cecil families made a decision that would permanently transform the identity of the estate. In 1930, Biltmore opened its doors to the public for the first time. The decision was both practical and visionary. By inviting visitors to tour the house and explore the surrounding grounds, the estate could generate revenue while preserving the property itself. At a time when many historic homes were disappearing, Biltmore was adapting to a new economic reality by redefining its purpose. The opening of the estate also had broader regional consequences. Tourism became an increasingly important part of the economy in Asheville and the surrounding Blue Ridge Mountains. Visitors traveled to the region not only to see the mansion, but also to experience the natural landscapes that had once formed Vanderbilt's private domain. Guided tours introduced the public to the architectural grandeur of the house. Visitors walked through the enormous banquet hall, the library filled with thousands of books, and the many guest rooms that had once hosted members of American and European high society. What had once been an exclusive world reserved for a small circle of family and guests became part of the shared cultural heritage of the nation. The transformation of Biltmore into a public attraction reflected a larger shift in American attitudes toward historic estates. During the early 20th century, many historic houses were preserved not as private residences, but as museums, educational institutions, or tourist destinations. This new model allowed architectural landmarks to survive even as the social structures that had created them disappeared. For the Vanderbilt descendants, the decision ensured that Biltmore would continue to exist as a living property rather than an abandoned monument. Yet it also marked the end of the estate's original identity. The mansion that George Vanderbilt had built as a private intellectual retreat had become something different, a historical site open to the public, sustained by visitors rather than by the immense industrial wealth of a single family. Even so, the transformation preserved something essential. The architecture remained intact. The forests and gardens continued to grow. And the story of the estate, its ambition, its scale, and its connection to the broader history of the United States, remained visible to those who walked through its halls. In the decades that followed, Biltmore would continue to evolve. Wars, economic cycles, and social changes would reshape the country around it. Yet the estate would endure, gradually becoming one of the most visited historic homes in the United States. The survival of Biltmore was never guaranteed. It required adaptation, difficult decisions, and a willingness to transform a private world into a public one. And through that transformation, the mansion that once symbolized the immense wealth of the Vanderbilt dynasty would become something far more enduring, a historical landscape that preserved the memory of an entire era. During the early 1930s, the decision to open Biltmore Estate to visitors proved essential for its survival. The Great Depression had devastated industries across the United States, and Western North Carolina was not immune to the hardship. Yet the presence of the enormous Vanderbilt estate created a small but steady stream of tourism into the region. Visitors traveled through the mountains near Asheville, eager to witness what newspapers and guidebooks often described as the largest private house in America. For the Vanderbilt and Cecil families, the transformation of the estate into a public destination required careful balance. The house was still a family home in many respects, yet it had also become a site of historical curiosity. Guided tours were organized to move visitors through the most significant rooms, the vast banquet hall, the richly furnished salons, and the library assembled by George Washington Vanderbilt II. These spaces allowed the public to glimpse the world of the Gilded Age, a period that already seemed distant amid the economic hardships of the 1930s. But the estate would soon face another global upheaval. In 1939, war erupted again in Europe, with the beginning of World War II. As the conflict intensified, many cultural institutions across Europe feared the destruction of priceless artworks and historical artifacts. Museums sought safe locations where their collections could be protected from bombing and military occupation. In 1942, an unusual partnership transformed Biltmore into a temporary sanctuary for some of the most valuable artworks in the United States. The National Gallery of Art had recently opened its doors in the American capital, but wartime concerns raised fears that its collection might be vulnerable if the United States were drawn deeper into the conflict. As a precaution, hundreds of artworks were transported from Washington to the quiet mountains of North Carolina. Within the thick stone walls of Biltmore, the estate's music room and several other secure spaces were adapted into temporary storage vaults. Paintings by European masters, including works attributed to artists such as Rembrandt van Rijn and Anthony van Dyck, were carefully packed and placed under guard. The remote location of the estate and the strength of its construction made it a relatively safe refuge during a time when cultural treasures across Europe were being threatened by war. For several years, Biltmore quietly played this unexpected role in the preservation of international art. Visitors touring the house during the war were often unaware that some of the most valuable paintings in America were hidden within its walls. The arrangement demonstrated how a private estate built during the height of industrial wealth had become part of a broader effort to protect cultural heritage during one of the most destructive conflicts in history. When the war ended in 1945, the paintings were returned safely to Washington, and the National Gallery of Art resumed normal operations. Yet the experience reinforced the evolving identity of Biltmore. The estate was no longer simply a historic mansion or a tourist attraction. It had become part of a larger network of cultural preservation. Meanwhile, the family itself was undergoing changes. Cornelia Stuyvesant Vanderbilt eventually separated from John Francis Amherst Cecil in the early 1930s and later moved away from the estate. Responsibility for managing Biltmore gradually shifted to John Cecil, who remained closely involved in its daily operations and long-term preservation. Maintaining the estate continued to require careful financial planning. The mansion, with its hundreds of rooms and enormous infrastructure, demanded constant upkeep. Gardens needed to be restored, roofs repaired, and historic interiors preserved. At the same time, the agricultural lands surrounding the house continued to operate as farms, maintaining the rural character of the property. Across the United States, similar estates faced difficult choices. Many Gilded Age mansions had already been demolished or converted into schools, hotels, or government buildings. Others fell into disrepair as their owners struggled with the costs of maintenance. In this context, Biltmore's survival represented an unusual success story. Part of that success lay in the willingness of the Vanderbilt descendants to adapt the estate to changing economic realities. Opening the property to visitors had created a sustainable source of revenue, while the preservation of farmland and forestry maintained connections to the estate's original economic foundations. Yet something deeper also contributed to Biltmore's endurance. The mansion and its surrounding landscapes had gradually acquired a new meaning within American cultural memory. What had once been a symbol of immense private wealth was now seen as an architectural and historical landmark, a tangible reminder of a transformative period in the nation's development. Visitors walking through the estate during the mid-20th century were not simply observing a luxurious home, they were encountering the physical legacy of industrial expansion, technological innovation, and social change. The stone towers and vast gardens represented the ambitions of a generation that believed economic progress could reshape the American landscape. As the decades passed, that legacy continued to evolve. Biltmore was no longer defined solely by the Vanderbilt fortune that had created it. Instead, it had become a historical environment where architecture, landscape design, and cultural preservation intersected. But the story of the estate was not yet complete. The final chapters would reveal how Biltmore survived the modern era, transforming itself into one of the most enduring historic properties in the United States while continuing to reflect the complex history of the family that built it. By the late 20th century, the meaning of Biltmore had shifted yet again. What had begun as a private estate built during the height of Gilded Age wealth had become something else entirely, a rare surviving landscape of American aristocratic ambition that remained not frozen in time, but alive within the changing economy of the modern South. Visitors arriving in the 1980s and 1990s encountered the estate as both a museum and a working landscape. The long drive through the forested grounds still carried the quiet drama envisioned by Frederick Law Olmsted more than a century earlier. Carefully shaped vistas opened gradually toward the house, preserving the deliberate choreography of arrival. Yet the experience of Biltmore was no longer that of invited guests crossing into the private world of George Washington Vanderbilt. Instead, hundreds of thousands of visitors each year moved along the same pathways, climbing the stone steps into the entrance hall and gazing upward at the vast hammer-beam ceiling that had once welcomed a much smaller and far more exclusive circle. Inside the house, preservation required continuous labor. A structure containing more than 250 rooms could not simply be maintained through occasional restoration. Climate control systems were gradually introduced to protect delicate furnishings and artworks from humidity and seasonal fluctuations. The estate's vast collection of books, still housed in the library George Vanderbilt had assembled with such care, required specialized conservation. The tapestry gallery, with its Renaissance textiles, demanded particular vigilance against light and environmental damage. Even the stone exterior required constant monitoring. Weather and time had begun to erode certain carved details in the limestone facade. Craftsmen trained in historic masonry periodically repaired joints and replaced damaged elements, often working from original architectural drawings preserved in estate archives. Yet the estate was never intended to become a static monument. The Vanderbilt family, still involved in its management through the Biltmore Company, approached the property as both historical inheritance and economic enterprise. Tourism revenue supported preservation, but innovation remained necessary to ensure the estate's long-term sustainability. One of the most significant developments occurred in the estate's agricultural landscape. The dairy farms and agricultural operations that had once served Vanderbilt's experimental vision had largely disappeared during the mid-20th century. In their place emerged a new enterprise that connected the estate's past with a growing modern industry: winemaking. In 1985, Biltmore established its winery, transforming portions of the estate's historic dairy complex into production facilities. The decision reflected both economic pragmatism and a symbolic return to the agricultural experimentation George Vanderbilt had once encouraged. Vineyards planted across the estate's rolling fields introduced a new layer to the landscape. Rows of grapevines stretching across terrain that had once supported livestock and experimental forestry. The winery soon became one of the most visited in the United States, producing wines that carried the Biltmore name into national markets. For visitors, the experience added another dimension to the estate's identity. What had once been a symbol of Gilded Age excess now participated in contemporary tourism culture, blending history, hospitality, and commerce. Yet beneath these developments remained the persistent question that had followed Biltmore since its construction. What did such a place mean in the broader story of American wealth and inequality? Historians increasingly interpreted the estate not simply as an architectural achievement, but as a physical expression of a particular moment in American capitalism. The Vanderbilt fortune had been built primarily through railroads, industries that transformed the national economy while also concentrating extraordinary wealth in the hands of a few individuals. Biltmore, with its immense scale and European inspiration, embodied the cultural ambitions of those fortunes. But it also represented the limits of that world. The social order that produced Biltmore, defined by inherited wealth, private estates, and rigid class distinctions, never fully took root in American society. The very forces that created the Vanderbilt fortune also reshaped the nation in ways that undermined the permanence of such aristocratic landscapes. The Great Depression had already demonstrated how fragile even the largest fortunes could be. Later economic changes, taxation policies, and shifting cultural attitudes toward wealth made it increasingly difficult for families to maintain large private estates without adapting them to public use. In that sense, Biltmore's survival depended not on preserving the social world that created it, but on transforming the estate into something new. Today, millions of visitors pass through the house each year. They walk through rooms once used for intimate family gatherings, guided by narratives that describe the lives of George Vanderbilt, Edith Vanderbilt, and their daughter Cornelia. They step onto the terrace overlooking the Blue Ridge Mountains, where George Vanderbilt once stood surveying the landscape he had shaped. For many visitors, the estate offers a glimpse into a vanished world of extraordinary wealth and privilege. Yet the story told within its walls has gradually expanded beyond simple fascination with luxury. Curators increasingly interpret the estate within the broader context of American industrial history, environmental conservation, and social transformation. The forestry program begun under Vanderbilt and Olmsted, for example, is now recognized as a foundational moment in American conservation history. The estate's forestry school, established in 1898, became the first of its kind in the United States and influenced the development of modern forest management practices. Today, portions of the estate remain actively managed forests, continuing a legacy that extends far beyond the Vanderbilt family itself. Similarly, the architecture of Biltmore is now studied not only as an example of Gilded Age grandeur, but as part of a larger conversation about cultural identity. The chateau-inspired design reflected a generation of American elites seeking legitimacy through European traditions, even as the United States emerged as a global economic power. Standing in the house today, visitors encounter that complex inheritance. The massive stone walls still convey authority and permanence. The great rooms still display the art, books, and furnishings Vanderbilt collected with scholarly enthusiasm. Yet the meaning of those spaces has evolved. They no longer serve as private symbols of wealth. Instead, they function as historical evidence, reminders of the ambitions, contradictions, and transformations that shaped the United States at the turn of the 20th century. The estate's survival into the 21st century therefore represents something unusual in American history. Many great Gilded Age mansions have been demolished, subdivided, or abandoned. Economic pressures and changing land values often made preservation impossible. Biltmore endured because the Vanderbilt family made a series of pragmatic decisions that balanced preservation with adaptation. Opening the house to the public in 1930 preserved it during the economic crisis of the Depression. Expanding tourism in the late 20th century ensured its financial viability. Developing new enterprises such as the winery allowed the estate to function as a living economic landscape rather than a static museum. These choices transformed Biltmore from a symbol of private fortune into one of the most visited historic properties in the United States. Yet despite these changes, the estate still retains something of the quiet atmosphere George Vanderbilt originally sought. Beyond the crowds that fill the house during peak seasons, the surrounding forests and gardens continue to reflect the vision he shared with Frederick Law Olmsted, a carefully designed landscape intended to evoke harmony between architecture and nature. From the terrace, the Blue Ridge Mountains remain visible in the distance, their contours softened by the atmospheric haze that early visitors described with quiet admiration. The view has changed little since the 1890s, when Vanderbilt first imagined Biltmore as a retreat from the pressures of modern life. In that sense, the estate continues to embody a paradox that has defined its history from the beginning. It was created through immense wealth generated by industrial expansion, yet it sought to offer refuge from the very modern world that produced that wealth. The tension between those two realities, between ambition and retreat, power and quiet reflection, still lingers within the stone walls and expansive grounds of Biltmore Estate. And perhaps that is why the story of Biltmore continues to resonate more than a century after its construction. It is not merely the story of one family's fortune. It is the story of an era when the United States grappled with the meaning of wealth, power, and cultural identity during a period of rapid transformation. The Vanderbilt estate stands today as both artifact and landscape, reminding visitors that the grandeur of the Gilded Age was never simply about architecture. It was about a vision of society, one that sought permanence, authority, and refinement in a nation still defining its place in the modern world. And within the quiet forests surrounding the great house, traces of that vision remain.